Kate is a bright-eyed engineer looking for someone to call daddy. Like, literally call daddy. She wants to say it out loud between the sheets. She wants to play little girl to her very own daddy Dom. Ty is her grumpy, significantly older boss who, yeah, once yearned for someone to call him daddy, but with his best days behind him, he's given up on the idea that it'll ever happen. Guess what? He is so very mistaken. Hi, this is Becca from Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Read. Here's the audio from my recent conversation with Eve Dangerfield, author of many utterly fabulous romance novels, including Kate and Ty's story, Act Your Age. We talk about Eve's books, as well as her transition from newsroom journalist to romance author, the semi-spiritual nature of her writing process, how her recent autism diagnosis changed the way she sees herself for the better, and much more. Hope you enjoy. I want to start with, it's a quote. It's a quote from your Reddit, Ask Me Anything. And all good things obviously come from Reddit. So
Yeah.
I think that's probably...
Nothing bad has ever happened on Reddit.
No.
Yeah.
What you wrote was, the main female character tends to be what I consider the best of me, and the male character is the worst of me. Every book is kind of an internal battle between what I want to be and who I am. I am Kate, and I'm also Ty, which is a reference, obviously, to Act Your Age. But I wanted you to tell me more about that. What did you mean by that, and how were best and worst assigned to those respective genders?
That's really interesting, and hopefully I can articulate this on the fly. I think it's probably partly internalized misogyny that I think women are expected to kind of be benevolent, kind. You know, the whole concept of the unlikable female character is that because women from a very young age learn how to perform accessibility and sweetness. You win and you lose either side of the gender spectrum, because I think women therefore cultivate more rich friendships and relationships because they are able to access vulnerability and empathy. And I think that I like those qualities in myself. And I, you know, as everyone does, but I think that the parts of yourself as a woman that you're taught to disavow, you know, your ambition, your anger, your selfishness, those things are obviously still a part of me. And I think that through exploring male characters, you explore what it would be like to kind of to be an asshole. But I like those parts of myself too, which is why I think I love all of my male characters, because I like those parts of myself. Even if it wasn't, you weren't writing romance, I think it would be very difficult to write a female character that basically acted like a man without having to have a million caveats and without a million, you know, people say that about the female characters I write, and I don't think they're nearly as confrontational as I could make a male character. And then I think in some ways there's also an aspect of bisexuality. You know, I'm attracted to men and women. So through a male lens, it's interesting to explore sexual kind of aggressiveness or, you know, sexual kind of forward power. So through that, I like to kind of explore that. But I think that, yeah, that is the thing, is like the issues that my male characters tend to have, you know, they're things that I have experienced too, you know, whether that's using alcohol to, you know, to block out emotions or anything like that. But I think it would be really hard to write a female character who did that, particularly in a romance novel. And especially if they hit the wines a bit too hard. Like, they don't want to see that reflected in a female character, regardless of how accurate that might be to how they actually behave in real life. There's sort of an awareness on my behalf of what people want to see and what they'll put up with.
Well, you brought up alcohol and what Kate and Ty are doing in Act Your Age, their sex life, this role playing, no problem with it. Obviously, quite the opposite. I love this book. There's one element, though, that distressed me. And when I say distressed me, I don't mean analytically. I mean, you have a gamut of emotions when you're invested in a story. So that's what I mean by distress, not judgmental distress. But the distress that I felt was the addition of alcohol. And
Yeah,
especially with Kate, because I'm really rooting for this couple to be able to live out this piece of themselves and to not have to question it. And with the addition of alcohol, I started asking questions like, what happens if something happens here that they later regret? The last thing I wanted was this thing to be tainted because of alcohol. And the sex in and of itself is already transgressive. And the alcohol adds this other layer to it. And later on in the book, toward the end, when Ty is aware that he kind of needs to get his act together if he wants to be Kate, there's this quote through the narrator. This thing with Middleton had been born in alcohol, sustained by alcohol, and brought low by alcohol. which is a quote that
Mhm.
would indicate that it's not necessarily in there to be sexy per se, in the same way that you can sort of spin workplace sexual harassment as sexy. So it's sort of
Yeah,
a
totally.
it's a dangerous game because your readers are already, some of your readers, ready to pounce on you as being
Yeah.
irresponsible. And then you put this piece in and it adds to that. So I want you to tell me why you took that risk. As someone who values
Yeah.
consent, why is it worth bringing that in? What were you doing with it?
Because I think that there's an interesting discussion. I can't remember who else has talked about this, but I know a lot of people feel the same way, which isn't to be like it's really important to make that distinction. I'm not one of those PC culture's gone mad, you can't do anything anymore, I'm above accountability. But there's an element of hand wringing and there's also an element of bad faith in the sense of if someone says, "Oh, it's bad that your characters drink and have sex," to which I kind of instantly want to be like, have you ever drunk and had sex?" Like I
Right.
was like, I'm trying to portray, yeah, it would be great that if people didn't drink and engage in risky sexual behavior. If my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. There's an element of my reflecting what I know, what I see, what I have experienced. Like I've, had experiences and I know people and I've been in scenarios where people shouldn't be doing things because they're extremely drunk, or even they shouldn't be doing things because they're moderately drunk. But that is our culture, especially Australian culture. And especially, I always had this vision of Ty. He's older still. He's a Gen Xer. Like, he is this man who is almost entirely shut off from his own instincts. And I think that whenever people are shut off from their instincts, they still have a desire to access them. They do tend to drink because they have to make the leap that you might make if you were comfortable, relaxed, you understood yourself, you had a great support system. That leap might be like a puddle. But for most of us, sort of locked off under late stage capitalism with all the trauma that we endure on a daily basis, it's like you have to make this quantum leap to be vulnerable with someone. And it's like I couldn't have done it without betraying how I think the characters would have acted. I'm not here to write PSAs on why people shouldn't, have more than 7 standard drinks, in and out. Like I myself barely drink. I've had long periods of sobriety, but I'm not interested in telling stories that I think are moral. Like I don't think consent is a morality thing. I think that's just how things are.
Hmm.
And I totally respect people's desire to read books where there isn't consent because that is a safe way to facilitate a sexy fantasy. But it's like when it comes to my own stories, it's like I don't want to change what I think a character would do because they shouldn't have more than 4 beers before they fuck someone. Like it would have felt to me unrealistic. And that's what I feel like in some ways I was doing. I was exploring how when you do use alcohol to kind of override your own inhibitions, that creates problems down the road. And I very much see that for Kate and Ty. It might have been better for them to have not done that, but I don't know that they could have had a sexual relationship because they both would have been so uncomfortable. And so like I suppose to sound very pretentious, that was the truth to me as I saw it. That the way that relationship panned out, that was true for how they would have acted. And that portraying the truth is always more important to me and more interesting to me than trying to portray something that in an ideal world might have been the case. I'm not writing a utopian novel because otherwise I would have written that. But it might have been quite boring.
Well, there's a bravery to it. In comedy, they talk about the idea of a hat on a hat. Like the joke is doing
Yeah,
fine. You don't need to add this other element. The sex is already transgressive. It's already doing something really interesting and unique. And some readers are not going to respond to it well, but screw those readers. That's not the point.
mhm,
But then you add another transgressive layer to it, which,
mhm.
I think about feminism, the sort of the stages of feminism, at least in America, these baby steps. We're going to do this. We can't afford to do all of that because we
Yeah,
need to sort of build up credibility. But you sort
yeah.
of dive in and throw multiple transgressive elements into the sex all at once without making those baby steps to lead people in slowly.
Yeah, because to me, it's interesting because I totally love that idea. You're right, like a hat on a hat, but like I'm not trying to be transgressive. We're getting into another area of interest for me, but it's like, most people who drink do drink a lot and they drink a lot, at home or they drink a lot socially and they couldn't imagine socializing without alcohol. It's more the idea that I want to see things rather than I want them to be reflected in my own culture. If we had a culture that was very vibrant and not dependent on alcohol for social reasons, I think I would reflect that more in my work. But that is kind of the reality that I perceive. So it's like, what's my responsibility as an ex journalist to tell the truth, to show things the way I think they would be in real life?
Well, one of the things I love about your work is you do this sort of human verisimilitude very well.
I really loved in Something Borrowed the fact that
Mhm.
Mel, who is about to instigate essentially revenge porn, and she's committing
Mhm.
so many crimes in that third act scene, is still someone that you can empathize with. She says that I think this is, that Jackson's the third person she's ever had sex with. This is something that obviously means a lot to her. So Mel is a person that could be really over the top, but you give her humanity in that scene. I want to punch her in the tit,
Mhm.
but I also want to weep for her. Speaking of verisimilitude, you sort of did an official foray into dark romance when you were doing the Snow White series.
Yeah, Snow White,
Yeah.
yes.
With your sort of foray into dark romance, it seemed like that was something you were excited about. And later on, you said that what was surprising to you is that you found it more restrictive than you
Yeah, I
anticipated.
did.
Can you tell
Yeah,
me about that?
I think I could actually thread a needle between my thoughts and feelings around the character of Mel and my disappointments with the Snow White series, if you'll bear with me. So you take a character like Mel, and to speak candidly, I've known a lot of girls. I think every woman's known a lot of girls like her, but it's very hard to say because you're a feminist, I'm a feminist. I love women. I think that so much of our behaviour is influenced by the tiny, tiny boxes we're forced into, but also it is deeply unpleasant to be around people like that. They are often very obnoxious, they are often rude. What's really interesting, I think, about people like that and why they're so catty is because they're so fragile. Their whole conception of themselves is so superficial and they're so cut off from their own what they would want to do. Like, who knows? Maybe Mel really wants to do nail art or geology or, but it's like you've just bought into this perception of what being a woman means, and your looks are the thing that everyone gives you praise for. Like, so it's like, I do see tragedy. I get goosebumps talking about it. I see tragedy in women like that because they're so cut off from themselves. And maybe we would never be best friends, but like, I think if you were authentic, you would be a lot happier. So when we jump to the Snow White series, doing the four guys who were criminals, what I found very difficult, and maybe like I'd love to go back in maybe and do another swing and try to do it even more evil and cartoonish, trying to ground the male characters in my sense of compassion and empathy. You can't do that. People like that who have those beliefs, who act in those ways, I look at them and I see, well, you would be a huge misogynist. You would cheat on your wife. Like, it's just that you can't be like that and not have that behavior ripple out into how you treat other people and the rest of the world. So, unlike Mel, where I was like, I feel like there could be hope for you, or I feel your essential humanity. I was writing a happy ending for these guys that I'm just like, I don't know, man. Like, they were very fictional and they couldn't be anything but fictional to me. And I found that quite difficult to give them a happy ending or to kind of want them to succeed when I was like, you need to go to therapy, like it's like, and not like sort of try to mum the shit out of them and be like that basically. And I did try to sort of towards the end, they're transitioning into more of a legitimate business, but it was like, it's not ethical that they have so much money. Like, like you find yourself kind of just like, oh, like I just didn't enjoy the moral conflict, I think. And so I couldn't make it as I thought it would be fun and liberating, but like my conscience kind of came in through the side door and was just like, what are you doing? And I was like, I don't know.
One of the things that brought you to the romance genre, if I understand correctly, is that you wanted to sort of take what many people would refer to as smutty books, basically sexually explicit content, and
Mhm.
elevate it to
Mm.
something akin to what you would find in contemporary lit. And
Yeah.
you
Yes.
have that analytical sensibility. I'm wondering if you were to write an essay or a thesis, if you haven't already, I couldn't find it if it's out there. But
No.
if you were to write something and sit down and sort of take as much time as you want, what would you be writing about?
In terms of outside of romance or
About the romance genre. Let's confine it
about
to
the
the
romance,
romance genre
yes,
right now.
romance. I've thought about this so many times because and I think that's why I've stayed around for so long. I'm endlessly fascinated and intrigued. I'm interested in what women like and I'm interested in why they like it because I think it is obviously fulfilling a very important need, which is, I think things that are really positive, which is like fantasy, safe sexual exploration. I think things that people have denied women, the need for sexual connection, you can take that away from people and you can tell women you don't actually have sexual desires, and yet you look at women screaming over the Beatles and Elvis. It's like that passion, that desire, that equality that we just have with men as people has always found a way to manifest itself. you can do whatever you want. You can try to oppress people, but if it's natural and it's a part of our biology, it will always reemerge. And it's interesting to me that men are very contemptuous and dismissive of romance novels, because I'm beginning to think that it's a feature and not a bug. We've got this thing that men have no interest in. They've got no interest in, even now, my Instagram followers, like one of my friends was like, do you get weird messages from people? I'm like, no, because all of my fans are women or non-binary people, or like, no, straight guys don't know I exist. And it's like wonderful, because I don't want them to know I exist in anywhere, any space, but the internet in particular. But I think if I wanted to do a thesis, it would be on how I think romance novels are sort of a natural expression of female sexuality, and how it's been cultivated in this perfect way where it's still very much our secret. And no matter how much people try to do essays saying, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, it's still our secret. And I think that that's such an interesting thing to me for such a hugely successful and productive product.
It's interesting. I mean, to go back to Reddit for a second, there's a phrase that I see a lot, which is, I said I loved it, not that it was good. If it's not good, if you can see that it's not good, what is it about that thing that isn't good that makes you not only tolerate it or think it's fun, but love it?
We've wandered into philosophy.
Yeah.
Because I would say a lot of times it's that it's not morally good. And that's not true in all cases, but that would be my first instinct. It's not morally good. Maybe the hero is a pig. You feel a rush of something towards it, but you can't have compassion for the fact that you feel that feeling, and you can't just be like, oh yeah, sometimes people like weird stuff. You have to kind of be like, it's actually bad, so I can't, you have to kind of have cognitive dissonance about what you like. Because again, I think like the amount of people who write reviews for my books and they're just like, I'm not one of those people, but I really liked that book. And I was just like, I totally don't mind. People can say that all they want. I think all I feel is like, oh, dude, just like it. Like, who gives a shit?
Yeah.
Like, it sucks that people care so much about what liking something says about them. And it's like, I don't think it says very much about you at all. It says that you liked something. Like, isn't that a good thing? Like, isn't it good to like things?
Yeah, and when I read that phrase, I'm thinking, oh, they think the writing is bad, run-on sentences or characters that aren't terribly deep or things that seem contrived. I mean, all of those things that you sort of pick away at. That's what I was thinking. But either way, it's true. Whether the characters are bad and you love it anyway, or the writing is bad and you love it anyway, there is something. Again, not to get too brainy. There's something about the collective unconscious that really
totally
breathes out into romance where it doesn't matter. You can be aware of the fact that this sucks or this is bad, quote unquote. It doesn't matter. You want it. And just how powerful that is.
That would be my theory to the writing is bad thing. Because I too, like, I have books in my Kindle that I revisit every couple of years. And when I say the writing is dog shit, and I'd never name the author, but like, I've probably given her $200 because I love her book. I have this theory that if you as a reader have a really vibrant imagination, all I'm really doing, we're actually collaborating on a project when you read my books. But you're doing a lot of the work yourself. And I have this theory that writing is just a medium of communication. And if I've been able to communicate something to you successfully, it's a good book. Like, I've given you a message and you've received it and you're lighting up. Not that, I enjoy reading people's fucking awful writing, but like, I think in some ways I can understand how you would, and I have myself enjoyed terrible writing. And also sometimes it's just fun. My partner and I will sit down and we'll read a terrible book and read lines out loud, and you laugh so much. And as long as you're not hurting the person and you're not, tweeting at them to be like, you fucking suck. Like, I don't think there's any harm in that either. People can enjoy your art however they want to.
Well, there have been books that I've loved everything about, and I sit down to write a review and I don't know how to articulate why. Why did I love this book? There's a negativity bias, I think, when you're writing a review or even talking about a book with someone else. You can remember in detail everything that you hated about it. Like, you can remember page numbers when you lost your mind. But you sit down and you want to write about why this was so great. And, it's this sort of freeze, like that I cannot find the words to describe it. And I think that is similar to what we were talking about with the idea of, I said I loved it, not that it was good, is that it can be difficult to articulate why. And that can be incredibly frustrating.
That's what I mean by the medium is communication. but the effect is emotion. And I think sometimes it is hard. A good book will make you feel, and it's not always easy to convert feelings into words. I recently found out that I've always done this, but I only think in pictures, that I don't think in words. I don't have an internal voice at all. And one of my friends was like, well, do you think that would make it hard to write? And I was like, no, I think it makes it much easier because I'm very used to translating images into words for communication, for talking. It's a skill that you already have. But I think that's the beauty of reading, like you said, when you can't say anything positive, maybe it's because you can only feel them. And again, feelings are hard to articulate.
Then this is probably a good time to segue into this question, which I ask all the authors that I work with. Talking about abstract concepts and putting them into words, I'd like to know, how would you define romantic chemistry? And how do you, specifically you, feel like you capture it on the page?
I think I would define romantic chemistry as someone becomes important to you to the exclusion of all others. And that importance can take the form of instant attraction. And, they're the romance novels where as soon as the people meet that they fall in love. Or, if we're going to go, act your age, you'd say with Kate and Ty, like you're constantly aware of that person. You might not have even talked to them for years, but you have a constant awareness and they play on your mind all the time. Or in the case of Alan Jackson from Something Borrowed, it's like this person that you don't even like, they suddenly have like a permanent residency in your mind. I think it can be dangerous. Like, I don't write about that, but I think in some ways, that can obviously turn into obsession, especially if it's like a parasocial relationship. But I think, yeah, that fascination and that interest in someone, then if it like moves into the stage where you're beginning a relationship with someone, you're learning about them, understanding them, and also having to kind of peel back the layers that you keep in place to keep yourself safe. And the other person will hopefully do the same. And that's when sexual chemistry or romantic chemistry, I think, really transitions into love. Now that, it's almost been 10 years since I wrote my first book, that I think I've made my peace with. So like, I'm not classically trained. Like, I went to uni for journalism. I'm not a classically trained writer. I have terrible spelling. That again, my mother was always fascinated. That she was just like, and again, when you find out that very recently I was diagnosed with autism, that becomes more obvious. But that this thing of like, I could read from a very, very young age, but my spelling was atrocious. So I don't really conceptualize the story, and it sounds really pretentious, and everyone, like, you're just going to have to bear with me, but it's like, I show it by feeling it. There's a period in my first draft, my partner likes to say, where it's like it's taking up a lot of spiritual and psychological energy to sort of dream everyone into life. You're imagining it, and you're like feeling it, and you're picturing it, and you're watching all the people take shape. And that's the first draft. But more than what you're putting down on paper, you're creating it in your own mind. And then consequent drafts are just about refining it. That then you're sort of doing brick and mortar stuff. You're being like, I've used that word too many times. Or
Yeah.
I think I do it by feeling it. I feel and accessing parts of myself. I don't know what it's like to date 4 guys in the mafia, but I do know what it's like to be really vulnerable and to be really scared of men. And so then you bring that in. And I know what it's like to be attracted to someone that you're like, oh my God, they're such an asshole. And you're like, from those, like, I think we talk about like the universal human subconscious. I think that you can access parts of those emotional experiences that are true and then transmit them. As long as you can bring in all of that, these characters, and they feel real to you. They feel alive. They feel like they have minds of their own. And that's the first draft, just sort of just letting them kind of come to life. I don't like sometimes when people are like, oh, then the character started talking to me. I was just like, there's just very few ways to talk about the craft of writing without sounding like a knob. Like, it's just like my spirits are talking to me, sounding like a clairvoyant or something. But it is, yeah, it's a spiritual process.
What you just described comes up a lot. This idea of, I think consistently, the last 4 interviews I've done, every one of those authors said it precisely what you just said. It does feel like something I worry that authors would get dismissive about. And they sort of say, oh, it sounds flaky, don't worry about it. But all of you are saying something very, very similar.
Very similar. And I think that for, I'm agnostic, bordering on atheist. I think organized religion is the worst. I was raised in the Catholic Church. But I think that there is an issue of, as a culture, we've sort of lost an aspect of spirituality. And I don't mean like weed crystals and incense. I mean like in the sense of you have to live in some mystery sometimes, and you have to be practical when you can be practical, and you have to give back to what people used to say, give to God what belongs to God. Is like that, but that concept of give back to what you can't understand, because you can go nuts playing 4D chess with your own brain, trying to figure out, where does it come from? And the fact is, it would be easier and not to dismiss your question, but it's not helpful for me to kind of sit around because I don't know. It's almost like I feel like it's like knowing how to play an instrument without having ever studied music. I would very much compare it to that. Like I know how to play the guitar, but I can't read music. I couldn't teach anyone how to play the guitar because I don't know how to play the guitar.
Yeah.
And whenever like someone suggested like, would you consider studying writing? I'm like, no, like I would be worried that the magic would disappear. You don't want to kind of analyze it too much. Like it's good, it's fine, it's working. Like let's work on problems that could be solved or things that need improvement.
I mean, I like what you're saying because you are sort of talking about a divining rod. And that in and of itself is helpful to say you know it. You can feel it when it's
and
right.
follow your own excitement. And like if
Right.
we were talking nuts and bolts advice, what you're interested in, that is always where the best work is. And that's why, you took a foray into dark romance. I've tried to do things and to be honest, like I care about myself and my own experience. So like if I'm having fun, then like that's all I care about, as long as I'm enjoying writing a novel. I did a short course for a university, but then COVID happened. But it was around writing, but it was more about like creative abundance, which I think like I completely understand. We live in a really dystopian capitalist world, but it's like creativity is for you. And as long as you're getting everything you need out of it, you really do, like, no amount of success is ever going to make you feel happy if you're not enjoying what you're doing. Like, if you're forced to write 8 books that you don't enjoy anymore, you're not passionate about that dynamic, you're not passionate about the genre, people can tell, and also you'll be miserable. Like, I don't want anyone to be miserable. Question why you want to do what you want to do. Is it because you love mystery novels and you want to write mystery novels? Or is it because you think it would be really cool to like, sidle up to your sister-in-law and be like, I wrote a novel. Jessica. Like, it's and unfortunately I think a lot of people do have that motive, whether they want to be honest about it or not. It's, I'd love to be a New York Times bestseller.
Exactly, it's validation.
And I get that. Like, I think I'm lucky in that regard where I don't seek out validation through my career. I have plenty of poor validation seeking out things, but I think like when it comes to creativity, really question your motives and then go where you're actually excited and where you're actually interested. Like even if it comes to nothing, that will never be a waste of time. That could never be a waste of time because it's a beautiful expression of where you were. And when I look at my own books, I love all of them because they're like photo albums or milestones along my own 20s. Like, and that's why I love them because they're so cool.
I mean, that's one of the things. People asking you to write a sequel to Taunt now. You were in a very different place in your life when you wrote Taunt. You were in your early
I was
20s.
still living with my parents.
You were living with your parents. You wrote Taunt. You were young, and you said one of the reasons that you used a pen name when you started writing was because of that. Because you were still sort of in your parents' world. And then later on, you said that you kind of have some regrets about that.
Yeah, I do. I think in the sense of like Eve Dangerfield's a great name, and I call myself Alex as well. Like I really have no kind of identity crisis. When I first started writing, I was very young. Like that was probably Taunt was my fourth book. I was probably younger than that when I started writing Degrees of Control. Authors barely had their photos on their Amazon pages. It was full cartoon avatar. Self-publishing was just starting to become really viable. And it was like, I just had this feeling of like, I think I can do this. And I want to be like, I knew I wanted to have my face out there. And I also knew that I wanted to be really kinky. So I might have to self-publish, like especially with Taunt. My first 2 were traditionally published, but then with Taunt, I was like, this is crazy. And I don't want people to make it less crazy. But I think it's like, I wish I had just called myself Alexandra Falls because it's like, that's who I was. And I hid it for a long time from not just my immediate family, but, my extended family or people I worked with. I wouldn't really talk about my books because I was scared that people would judge me. And I think I was probably right to worry about that. I wish I'd been able to just be like, this is who I am, this is my name, this is my face. Because a lot of authors who would write the most kinky shit in the best way in their actual interviews or on podcasts, they would just be kind of like, ha 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 ha. I'd never actually do that. Whereas I always wanted to be like, yeah, I'm into this stuff sexually. Like, that is what I am into because I am into it. Like, I didn't want to play that game where you're somehow dedicating hundreds of hours to writing these filthy novels, and then when someone asks you about it, you're kind of like, no, that was just like a brain exercise, or
It's such a huge piece of who one is. I think if someone wanted to be a bastard, they could say, well, if you're sex positive, then why don't you put your name on it? Choose
That's
who you
brand
are.
recognition. It does, and that's what I said. I think it's like for that reason. I always think of Cara McKenna, who also wrote under the names
I
Meg
love,
McGuire.
yes.
I love her too, but then she was like, she wrote a book under like a more literary book under like C.K.M. McKenna, and I was just like, this is batshit, man. That's too many names. Like, I love you, but like that's too many names. And she's not writing anymore. But I always kind of thought that I was like, if I have to publish under Eve Dangerfield, I don't mind because it's better than trying to be like, no, that's like my other name. From like, I was like, the least amount of confusion as someone
Right.
who gets very confused by people's names. But I would also say to the authors who didn't want to talk about their own sex lives, a lot of them were mothers. Women aren't allowed to have sexuality in general, but in specific, the idea that you're a mother and, oh, what would your kids like, all of that. It's crazy to think this was the 2010s, and that was the prevailing attitude and might still be the prevailing attitude, which is like, how dare your children find out that you wrote about some people having sex once? Like, it's this attitude of, I think, that's always leveraged against women, which is like, what are your future progeny going to think about this? And it's like, oh my God, I don't know.
Can you tell me more about the autism diagnosis? How recently were you diagnosed?
Really recent. I think it's
Okay.
really interesting that I was kind of ruminating. I have a character in mind. I have a whole plot in mind for my next novel. And I was it was missing something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And I think that I would probably have her be autistic now. Because in some ways, Kate, I did not get diagnosed with ADHD until last year. And when I say I had no idea, I had no idea. So it's very funny that Kate, that was a friend of mine who had ADHD that I, with her permission, the same way I've included a non-binary character into Begin Again, which is a friend of mine who's non-binary, is like, I thought I was kind of just like co-opting with the permission of someone I loved an identity that I found really valid and really important. But then it was surprising to me how many people with ADHD were just like, that's a great book about ADHD. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, I did a good job. And then it's not until obviously recently that I've been like, that's obviously a big part of me. And I think that without realizing it, I was voicing my own feelings and my own experiences and my own concerns. And then as far as the autism goes, so I've been on stimulant medications for over 9 months, and they weren't quite having the effect that I wanted to. And I was like, well, they don't work for everyone, et cetera, et cetera. And I was diagnosed through like a bulk billing clinic. Like, so I don't know, it might be, do you know anything about Australia's Medicare system? Medical system?
I know a little bit about New Zealand, but not.
Yeah, New Zealand's is better. My partner's from New
Yeah.
Zealand. But like, so New Zealand's is better. Australians is basically like, we're in the process. Our governments would love nothing more than to have the system you guys have. So slowly we're chipping away at our publicly funded medical health. So especially for things like ADHD or like conditions that need to be managed and supervised with a lot of attention and care. I went through a bulk billing clinic, which is like, you pay $20 and you see the doctor. And she was essentially just throwing medication at me. I tried every possible, Ritalin, Dexedrine, Vyvanse, and it was kind of going a bit nuts. So eventually it broke my heart in a way, but I went to like a private practice, where the doctor could meet with me for half an hour and we would actually discuss my diet, my weight, things that like had obviously clear outcomes. And she also referred me to an ADHD and like a management specialist, psychologist who also works with autism and autistic children. And she was great. But between the two of them, because obviously they were in communication about my outcomes and stuff, they sort of started to be like, well, you display a lot of other behaviors. I walk on my toes. I always have, which is obviously, I walk on my toes. I scratch myself when I'm stressed out. I always have. I have difficulty holding pens and pencils, using my hand. But it's like, I've had an eating disorder and eating issues, which is also, and gut problems and ear infections when I was a kid. And eventually my doctor was just like, I just want to tell you that you raise a lot of flags for autism. And if you are autistic, which I am, because then once we did the actual proper test, it was like, yeah, woo, super high. that was, and it was wonderful. It was such a huge relief. And even my partner said with ADHD, I was like, okay, well, it feels true. We'll take the medication. We'll see how it goes. Whereas autism, it was like, I just felt like, yeah, that's it. Reading the Unmasking Autism book. It also means like, ever since I was very young, I didn't, not in a special way, but like I felt like there was something different about me. Things were really hard for me and for my parents as well. And part of why I think I mask and I appear much more high functioning than I am is because they were teachers and they were very involved. So anywhere where I lacked, they would coach me. I struggled to do up my shoes. So we'd just do it over and over and over again until by rote behavior, I could essentially basically appear completely neurotypical. But these things where it's like it's very difficult for me to make eye contact, it just lots of things like that make so much more sense now. And the distress that I would feel on an almost daily basis, and this belief that I could fix it through my own behavior, that somehow I was going to stumble on the perfect formula and be able to sort of function in a way that I saw other people functioning. It's like, well, I can just give up on that now. That's just,
And again, there's that misconception that if you're on the spectrum, you don't feel, or you don't feel the way other people feel. I mean, but there are more and more romance authors who they traffic in feeling, in articulating feeling. And I think it is wonderful evidence that that's just bullshit, that this idea that there's this disconnect with feeling. I think that if you wanted to bring in all of the autistic authors who write these books that are built on intense feeling, well articulated intense feeling, that is incredible proof of that being nonsense.
Completely. That is the conversation I've had with, everyone from like mental health professionals to my own family, is like that obsession I have with understanding people and how they work and conversations and how they work. And it's like, I don't see it as a bad thing at all, but I do, Devon Price, who's a trans man, wrote a book about, like, obviously they were assigned female at birth, but they were a PhD, they were a psychology specialist. They think that that's a similar thing of like, you go into that field because you're obsessed with trying to figure out how to be normal and how to be like other people and how to practice and do dummy runs of conversations. And I think that the thing about being autistic is there's nothing wrong with me. If this was 1,000 years ago and we were all living in a field picking mushrooms, how would that affect anybody? It's a problem because I have to function as an independent entity in like 15 different ways, run a household, the expectations on me to perform at levels to which no one no one can really do, and then neurodiverse people can do even less. And it's like, I can do that. I can perform normality today, but there will be incredibly negative side effects. And the only people who tend to see that are your immediate family. So when other people are like, oh, but you seem blah, 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 I'm like, yeah, but how would you know? It's the same thing as when I think I've had friends who stop drinking and they get sober. And I hate when people do this, but they say, other people will say, oh, but you were so fun. It's like, you weren't there. You were there in the fun times. You weren't there. Who knows what it was like for them in the days that follow being really hungover and, how low they got. It's like, I just think people don't really understand that a lot of people don't function behind closed doors nearly as well as they can present.
Right. Well, years and years of experience masking, and you literally had teachers teach how to do this.
Teach me. Yes.
So by a certain age, of course you can do it well because you're doing it every single day. Of course you're going to be good at it.
But obviously it results in, it was really interesting to me, substance abuse, self-harm, suicidal ideation, these are all incredibly common things of people who, because you don't realize, like I didn't realize I've taken it all off, but I would wear jewelry, not very much, but I hated jewelry. That was the whole thing in my family. When you were a girl, all you got was jewelry. So for my 21st birthday, when I said no jewelry, all I got was cash. But I realized, and again, it's been only less than 2 weeks, but it's like, I was just like, oh yeah, look, I'm wearing jewelry. And also I hate tying up my shoes. It's a joke, but my partner does it for me. And we used to, it's cute, but it's like, I need like slide on shoes. It's like these things that you haven't even been able to perceive were very stressful to you until you're looking at it through this lens of sensory issues. Like, what is upsetting to me? What clothes would I like to wear? If you prioritize that, you can live at such a higher quality of life that it is almost baffling. But until you don't know, and that low level of distress that you're just constantly in because you're feeling unwell in your own body is so scary.
Do you have trouble trusting your instincts sometimes as an author? I mean, obviously you're leaning into feeling, obviously you're leaning into momentum, but are there things where you're like, okay, I definitely need my editor or my alpha reader or my beta reader or my friend to look at this because this is precisely the kind of thing that I can't trust my instincts on?
I'd say I have the opposite problem. I would almost, and it is nice not to tie everything back to a really recent diagnosis, but from the framework of I only trusted my own feelings, I only trusted my own instincts, and I think there's multiple reasons for that. But it also seemed to me is like one of the things I discussed with my therapist or whatever is that from a very young age I had this perception of like, well, people want to be lied to. And I think the reason why I had that is my Zia was, when I was very young, said like, oh, I'm 45 now, I'm so old. And I said, yeah, but you know, you're lucky to still be alive. And she went and told everybody and they all laughed at me. And then they submitted it to one of those like kids say the craziest shit magazines. And so what I learned as a child is like, you can't trust what people say. People say they want the truth, but that's not really what they mean. And that the older I got, I kind of had more of a sense of you are the only person who you can trust in terms of you know what your motivations are. And I think that really came out in my writing for the better in some ways. Like I had my own very strong convictions about what I liked. And it's still kind of the Eve Dangerfield, Alexandra Falls show in that regard. I think I've never really gone to my editor with anything other than how far should something go, and that would probably only be in regards to like I think this joke is funny but like it might be like a bit too edgy, and I was like, and he usually is more, he's conservative and he will usually call it and say don't put it in, like but I think as far as a story goes, like no, I trust my own instincts. I'm like, again, I don't think, you know, and I don't ever feel like I'm you know trying to be a stand-up comedian and be like, look at me offending everyone. Like, I think I have good instincts for stories.
I know that some authors have blind spots.
I was going to say, if you want to hear a funny story, you're absolutely right. Authors have blind spots. One of my niche interests, which are like I'm constantly trying to wedge into my novels, is freak accidents. Like I have this obsession with freak accidents where like I just am interested in them. I think they're fascinating. Like it's not morbid. It's just more like, you know, freak accidents. Like we walk around and we're so worried about so many things, but freak accidents happen all the time. Bobby's mum, and this is from the Snow White trilogy. Do you want to know how I originally wanted her to die? I handed the book to my editor, and he just turned and looked at me when he read that part and was just like, stared at me for like a good minute, I think. I wanted Bobby's mum to be like on an airplane, and sometimes there's really bad turbulence, and the trolleys fly off and hit people. And so my editor was just like, so in the middle of January and Bobby are having this very romantic, intimate moment where he's confessing that, you know, his mother tragically passed. You want her to be hit by a trolley in an airplane? And I was like, well, when you say it like that, it sounds dumb. But like, yes. And he was like, no. And you see, like, so that of blind spots, yes, I definitely have them in that regard where I was like, you know, it's just, it's interesting, it's memorable, and he's just like, it completely takes you out of the moment and is very silly. But I was like, you know, how will people know about freak accidents if I don't bring them up in my novel? I think that was the problem with the Snow White trilogy too. Like Doc was funny and there was some funny banter, but I think that I think I would almost say because it needed to have like a fantasy element in terms of the fairy tale fantasy, or it almost made it difficult to do humor because it is, to use your like line from earlier, it would have been like a hat on a hat. I think if you're asking people to kind of absorb this hyper real world, the last thing you also want to be doing is bringing in humor and absurdist humor, especially. And I think that was the thing, is like my editor Philip was like, you can't have a weird, like this is meant, it's taking you out. Whereas like, yeah, if I think I could have freak accidents. In fact, I think I have finally worked in at least a conversation about freak accidents into my current novel, because I'm just like, freak accidents forever. But it's like, that was another thing I struggled with the Snow White series, where I was just like, you don't want to be kind of distracting or giving people more stuff that's like taking them out of you want it to be very grounded in reality. So it's like for something like Taunt, the humor was providing levity and the violence was providing grit. But it was like with the Snow White series, it's like the fantasy, the fairy tale is providing levity, the violence is providing grit, and there needs to be like a very, very, very heavy, I would describe it, layer of like practicality technicality. Like I wanted it to always, I was very conscious of the scenes where the guys were talking with any of the subcontractors. I wanted it to sound as legitimate as I could make it, because I was like, so then adding too much humor would have just kind of blown the top off the whole thing. It's like, you want it to kind of have this very baseline practicality reality thing. Otherwise this is just going to seem really fucking stupid. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, but humor is also catharsis, and I think that's one of the
It
reasons
is.
I like it in the third act of Taunt, is because it's coming up when those guys, all four of those characters, need a moment to sort of demonstrate their affection to some extent for one another by being playful, and that felt, again, that is an extension of the weird verisimilitude that you do. The sort of, a lot of people would say verisimilitude. Obviously, these people aren't joking around. This is a life and death situation. As they're leaving the house, obviously these people aren't making jokes. That's not true.
No.
Humor is a form of catharsis, and of course, in situations like these, it's just yet another way of people blowing off. It felt natural because, again, you sort of talk about your characters sort of being who they are, and like you can't quite explain it. You were letting them be who they are, even if other people said, "Well, it didn't make sense." And it's like, I can't argue with you about the fact that this is who they are.
Completely. And that I've been in several life or death situations, and the things that have always struck me will always be that people will die making jokes. You know what I mean? Like people, and that you can see it in people who work very closely with death, doctors, like people like you. If anything, your sense of humor becomes sharper. And I think that's why, in some ways you say, stand-up comedians are the most miserable people you'll ever meet, or, that it's like, it can almost be warped in some ways, but I think it's a very natural thing for people to try to be funny, to try to alleviate themselves and other people's difficult feelings in times of stress. Like that's just the most normal thing in the world to me. Why wouldn't you be making jokes because you're scared, or because you're angry, or because you're afraid? Like It's just, it's really nice. Like it's helpful, I think.
You've spoken before about being an ex-journalist. Can you tell me a little bit more about the kind of journalism that you were doing?
So I studied journalism at university, but I was really lucky when I was just about to turn 19, a cadetship at my local newspaper opened up, and I walked in there thinking like they wouldn't hire me, and they did. And so because my lecturers were pretty like, obviously like, this is a great opportunity, I got to kind of move my university around so that I could work pretty much full time as a journalist, which I did until I was a little bit older. But like I worked there, and it was like, so it was a really interesting, people used to say journalists are made in country newspapers, a thing that no one can ever say ever again. Journalism is dead as fuck, and it was already rife with sort of nepotism anyway. It's a very easy job for some cushy asshole to give their kid or their nephew, or you know what I mean? So even now, more so than ever, I would say most journalists get there because of literally who they know, whereas at least before there was some chance that you could work your way up through talent. But country newspapers, you cover everything. You cover crime, you cover natural disasters, you cover politics, you cover local events, you do your share of man grew giant pumpkin bullshit. But it's a really good crash course into, so I predominantly covered whatever there was. If you were in the office and that was when, there was a big car crash, or there was a fire, or you were the one who went out and did it. So I covered loads of different things for my paper, and I would say I preferred politics, and I really liked crime, not in the sense of, again, I think it fits my interests kind of a thing, natural disasters, those kinds of things. But it was a very, I was, yeah, freak accidents. But that was the instances where I would see people who families just died. I saw dead bodies on the side of the road, because I would go with the police. So it was a very, when I think about it now, it shocks me how young I actually was. You're that age, you're the oldest you've ever been. You think you're so grown up, but like I think about 19-year-olds, or like you see them in bars, and you're like, who let these fucking 12-year-olds drink? Like as soon as you're older, you understand that to most adults, 19. Again, you're still kind of a baby. But I think it taught me a lot about the world. It taught me a lot about how things work. And it was, it could be really rough. People were really sexist. People were really fucking gross. But that taught me a lot as well. I think it was a really good crash course. And I think in some ways, I've been saying lately, I think journalism will always be my true love. I love nonfiction. I love investigations. Like I could have really seen myself doing something that I was passionate about in journalism, but I don't think it's a viable career, in the sense of like, not like I could work really hard and try trying to achieve something. But I like writing romance novels, and I'd really rather not kind of, just I don't think I have the energy.
I worked at a small town newspaper too, and we always put our best writers covering the most boring stories. So if like city government was meeting, some stupid meeting, we'd always put the best writers on, because one of the things that you were learning in those situations is how to make mundane things interesting. And I think that is really great practice for someone who wants to transition into creative writing, because it's kind of the same thing. You kind of have to sift out, how can I make these mundane moments sparkle? How can I get the attention of people? Because this information I'm giving is important, but how do I make sure that my readers remain hooked? And obviously, and you have to have a good lead. But it's interesting too. I was 19 and I had to cover a suicide, and I was on a features beat, but I was rarely on news. But that night I was the only one in the office, so they put me on the suicide case, and it was having to contact people and ask them about it when it was still so fresh. I mean, I realized then that at the very least I couldn't do newspaper journalism, because I think I had to go into, the staff lounge and cry every like 10 minutes. It was really hard to do. You're asked to do things as a sensitive person. And there were other people in the office who were sort of rubbing their hands together, ooh, juicy news story. But
I hated that.
Yes.
I hated that culture. I thought like that vulture, like I got sent to work for a network, like when I was made redundant along with a bunch of other journalists, beginning of the end, when I was still in my early 20s. And I did 2 weeks at a commercial TV station, and I just, before it came time for me to actually sign the contract, and I was like, I'm out of here. I can't do this. This is bloodthirsty. And I've only been validated more and more by that as I've gotten older, and I've worked in like communications roles and stuff. I don't anymore. I've been writing full time for 3 years now. It's been the best thing ever. But like coming into contact with journalists from the other side of the desk, it's just like, fuck you. You are disgusting. Like you're just, it was just, now it's just all sensationalist dog shit. I think journalism lives on in like yourself, but also, YouTube, people still podcast, people are still doing investigations, and that's what I mean by journalism. Like, I think the human drive to analyze and understand things, again, almost like romance novels, continues to manifest itself because it's a need that we clearly have. But I don't think I could be a commercial journalist, because it's just the pay is shit, the people are awful, what you're asked to do is so degrading. And the idea of sort of harassing people who've recently experienced a tragedy just is so beyond what I would ever be able to do.
I asked you earlier if you would write a thesis or an essay in the romance genre. If you were to write a thesis or an essay on anything that you want to talk about, what would you be writing about right now?
I have a real fascination with, and this is only a really niche interest, but I do generally have certain interests in like the field of addiction, how we understand addiction, how we treat it, what it's perceived as, blah blah, substance abuse, blah blah blah. I have a real current fascination with vaping. Australia's trying to ban disposable vape products.
Right.
And the interest, my opening metaphor would probably be being out with a friend who I, didn't know that well, and her friends. And I noticed that there were maybe 7 or 8 people vaping. And I realized I have never been in a social group of my peers where there are that many people smoking cigarettes in my entire life. Is like that generation where it's like, our parents smoked, then there was kind of nothing for ages, and then all of a sudden, boom, people are consuming nicotine again at crazy rates. That is fascinating to me. I also think that it would be really interesting to discover issues of human sexuality. I think as the understanding of gender starts to move, it also seems that people who are deeply entrenched in those ideas are kind of swinging further into polarizing opinions. So it's like, that is obviously something that fascinates me a lot. What investment people seem to have, which strikes me as very confusing, because it's like, how can you ever know how anyone else feels? So how could you have an opinion on whether someone's a trans person or not? So it's that's something that fascinates me. I think the fields of sort of human psychology and coping mechanisms are stuff that are always very interesting to me.
Have you read The Body Keeps the Score?
Yes, I have. I love that book.
There's some really good books coming out. It would be interesting if someday you are ready. That kind of work is such a valuable contribution. It isn't just interesting, it isn't just intellectual, it isn't just intriguing, it is necessary. When people's sense of identity and feeling alone and feeling judged and feeling shamed and feeling confused The more the better. The more books like that, the better.
I think at the risk of sounding pretentious, like, but I think that always was my mission. As I get older, it always surprises me at how clear it was, even at a younger age, what I wanted to accomplish, which is that I wanted people to feel less alone. That I loved romance novels, but every single romance novel was a virgin who was about my age and who didn't act or sound like anyone I'd ever met in my whole life. And I wanted, in some ways, to reassure people that you can be different. You know, that love and sexuality belongs to you. That there's that there's ugly parts, and even now, it's like in expressing the bad parts of female characters or male characters. It's like everybody has these things, and it's fine. We can all work together. So, which is the point of psychology, I think, is to try to find a shared humanity and to realize that you're not alone in your worst instincts or in your beliefs about yourself. That it's that I think that if we had a problem, and you'd think the internet could correct this with oversharing, but I don't know what it's doing. But it's like the way people still feel so alone in their problems, and they still feel, and not in a selfish way, but people genuinely still feel so isolated and like that they're not worthy of kind of claiming the mantle of someone being damaged. You know what I mean? It's like, well, I
Yeah.
don't deserve that I feel this way. And it's like, that is to me the biggest tragedy, because it's like, not only do you feel that way, but now you feel guilty for feeling that way. It just feels like such a waste of time. I really hope my books reassure people and they make them feel less alone, and that they feel comforted and that they feel loved. Because I think I do, for all my talk of being the boss, like I really love the people who are interested in me. I think I have a great affection for them. And I want people to feel good because of what I do.
With books like Act Your Age and Something More, but also, I mean, really with Act Your Age, with Ty's. Poor Ty. Ty is such a character that he broke my heart. This sense of having lost decades of his life to not being
Mm-hmm.
able to be who he is because he sort of grew up at the wrong time and he didn't meet Kate
Totally.
at the right time. He's sort of really obsessed with what he couldn't have. That aloneness, being able to find the sex, but not the love and the sex. You capture that beautifully, and I love that. I love that about your work. So I'd say you're
Oh,
successful in that mission very much.
thank you. I was only gonna say, like, I find that is something we have all met people, I think, even if we don't realize it. And I think it really comes from the USA, America. This idea of like all these trite little "it's never too late," blah blah blah, no looking back. That culture forms because the reality is that we all know people who are living like they've just lived tragically lives, and it is a bit too late for them. And it's like a Ty was my first where I was like, no, it is too late for him. The same way, if you're a gay person and you were in your 70s or your 80s, you might feel, if you're lucky, you feel only compassion and love and support, and you're not like one of those assholes that's like, you're not allowed to get your student debts cancelled because I had to pay for them, because like those people fucking suck. But it's like, of course you feel a sense of loss and grief, and this almost like, why was I born in this time where my life, where maybe I did get married and have kids with a woman instead of marrying someone I was actually attracted to. And it's like, I think we're very uncomfortable with that idea of, I have regrets and I will never get that time back. And it's like, you need to have compassion for the fact that you feel that grief, and people try to shove it away. And it's like, no, that like only makes it worse. Like, you were allowed to have regrets. You were allowed to be like, I missed out, like I lost, like that sucks. Like with therapy, with like the hardest thing is you have to walk a middle line. You have to grieve your loss while also being able to work through it. But you can't rush either step. If you rush straight into, I'm going to fix it, it's over, I don't regret anything, like you're in denial. And if you stay too long in grief, you become bitter, and you become, I suppose that's kind of what Ty is in the process of doing, becoming bitter and seeing himself as sort of this king of this ruined empire that he's slowly losing, his looks, he's losing his sort of ability to appear as someone people should take seriously, which I think is something that older men really struggle with, is that, you're slowly losing this privilege that has allowed you to like really exert dominance over people for a very long time. But it is that feeling of like, you do need to move on, but your grief also needs respect.
That's why I hate It Is What It Is, because usually people
Yeah,
say, I could see
yeah,
someone like Ty being like, oh, wait, it is what it is. And it's like, no, I mean,
yeah.
yes, but no. I mean, yes, you can stay where you are. You can stay with that bad feeling. We can stick with this bad feeling for a while. You don't have to dismiss it. You know what I mean? That sort of phrasing, I get it. I really do. But no, it is what it is. But please still allow yourself the pain.
Yeah.
Don't dismiss it. And
No.
you deal with people you write people who have to learn how to not dismiss these pieces of themselves. And that is why the books are so, I mean, and I don't want to sound pretentious either. I don't want to sound like I'm making too big of a deal, though. I think your work is important. And I think that the sex and the humor draws people in, and then they are receiving something incredibly, whatever it is. I loved Act Your Age because I came in expecting one thing, and then I got hit with something so much more complicated and beautiful. And that is one of the reasons it's an important book. It isn't just the content, it is the ability to draw these people in who weren't prepared for it and really needed that experience.
And that's what I said. And I feel the same way because I think if I don't agree with people who say romance novels are porn or whatever, just on principle.
No, porn is porn.
Like, porn is porn. But even if I was writing porn, and there's nothing wrong with that, is like, as I already said, is like, I think the process of falling in love and finding what I would consider like a sustainable, loving relationship is the process of vulnerability. And it's like, that's why, like, when people are like, is it hard to think of a conflict? I was like, no, have you ever been in relationships? There's always conflicts. You know, sometimes you're having to let go of what you imagined your future would be. Sometimes you're having to actually confront something that you've been happily ignoring for the better part of 20 years. Like, it's just, love also has this way of tearing people open and asking them to address things that they've been suppressing for a very long time. And it's like, you're right. Like, I think it's like you start off with all the love and the fun stuff, but like essentially every romance novel, almost like a hero's journey, is a story of self-acceptance and vulnerability and the power of communication.
That's it. Very, very big thank you and very, very big love to Eve Dangerfield / Alexandra Falls. And big thank you to you, whoever's listening right now at this very moment. I'll reserve the big love until we know each other better, but hey, keep hope alive.